I lived in the United States for many years, and I was shocked at how much green there is here. And so I must say, you live in an amazing place. Do not take it for granted. It is an absolute delight and pleasure for me to be here this evening. I have to tell you, I'm not sure I would have shown up with the amount of rain that's outside. So I'm really grateful that you've made it. And to me, it really is a signal that you, like me, are incredibly concerned about the state of affairs, not just in Africa, but across the developing world, in places where countries continue to rely very heavily on the largesse from outside. What I thought I'd do this evening is really spend some time talking a little bit about some of the arguments that I make in the book. I don't want to give you everything so that you can go out and buy it, but also talk a little bit about solutions. And my intention in this book was not to be a naysayer. A friend of mine once said there are two types of people. There are yes people and there are no people. And I happen to come from a home of yes people, because my parents somehow were so deluded that they didn't tell me that actually there were certain things I was not supposed to be able to do. So being raised in the Moyo household basically meant that when I said I want to go and study in the United States, they said, absolutely, go ahead, you can do it. And I only found out later that people would say, well, actually, you know, you're an African woman from Zambia, so maybe you won't be able to make it there. So I'm a yes person. My book is about things that we as a global society can and should be doing to actually transform the African condition. My main thesis is very simple. The current aid system that pervades the African continent is, I believe, couched in what George Bush, and I have to say, I'm very surprised I'm quoting him, but what I believe George Bush said was the soft bigotry of low expectations. I strongly believe that there is one method and policy of economic development when it comes to countries like China, Russia, India, Brazil, and a completely different approach to economic development when it comes to countries across the African continent. I'm here to tell you today that for the past 60 years, over $1 trillion of aid has gone to Africa. That's about $100 for every man, woman, and child on Earth today. And yet, growth is less today than it was in the 1970s. And in the 1970s, 10% of the African population lived on less than $1 a day. Today, over 70% of Africans live on less than $1 a day. Clearly, something is wrong. And I'm here to explain to you what I think is going on. In fact, what I know is going on. I was raised in Zambia, Southern Africa. I went to primary school, secondary school, and university until we had a coup d'etat in 1991. Any good African country has to have an attempted overthrow of government. So we had ours in 1991. And so anyone who says that I am not African or somehow, as Jeffrey Sachs has said, I don't have a child in rural Africa, therefore I have no right to say anything about what's going on in the continent is completely absurd. My family lives in Africa. I'm in Africa about once every 5 weeks, somewhere across the continent. And I think it's really important for us as a global society to take a good, hard look at what's going on across this continent. I want to start off by saying that there are at least 3 things that I believe we agree on. And by we, I mean the world in general. I think it's very easy for people to say, well, she's against aid and he's pro-aid and they're fighting against each other. And having spent many years living in the United States and also in Europe, I know there's a lovely tendency for people to want to pigeonhole people. She's Republican, he's Democrat, she's black, he's white, she's between 40 and 45 and so on. So we're always categorizing. And so immediately my book came out, I got labeled as a right-wing, anti-aid person. And I'm here to say that we should not, as a society, get caught up in these titles. I think it's critically important that we look at the issues based on logic and evidence, which is why I love coming to academic institutions, and not on emotion, because the emotion has not helped. There are specifically 3 things that I believe we all agree on. The first thing I believe we all agree on is that nobody wants Africa to be dependent on aid forever. And by the way, I always offer the opportunity to the audience, if anybody thinks that we do want to see Africa on aid forever, you're welcome to put your hand up and we can have that debate. But I think the goal, which tends to be lost, is We would love to see Africa and African countries and Africans as equal partners on the global stage. We don't want to live in a society where it's us and them, donor and recipient, and Africa continues to be viewed very much as a drag on the global economy. The second thing I think is critically important that we need to understand is that we need African governments to be involved front and center at the development agenda. It is not good enough for Westerners as individuals to care about Africa. And it's not good enough for African individuals like myself to care about Africa. And nor does it matter if America or Western governments care about Africa, if the African governments themselves are not leading the charge of economic development. This is really, really important. And there was a wonderful article that was written by President Kagame of Rwanda back in February this year in the Financial Times, where he said people need to remember they should not pretend to themselves that they care about our continent more than we do. And I think that was a very, very powerful statement. Certainly as an African, it was really quite moving. And I have noticed, having spent a lot of time on the road this year, that people do have that sense that somehow they care more about Africa than we as Africans do. And yet our families live there, we are from there, and hopefully generations to come of Africans will be able to live there in decent living conditions. So we need African governments involved. The third point, I have to say, I've completely stolen. It's a point that was made by the Minister of Development in Norway. Some people in here might be aware that Norway gives 1% of its income, the country's income, to aid. So when my book first came out, I got an invitation to go to Norway. I was pretty surprised. I was like, this is weird. A country that gives them so much aid has asked me to go and visit with them. I don't know if there are any people from Scandinavia, Norway in here. Anyone? No? Nobody? Oh, somebody there in the back. Anyway, they're very open people, and you know they love a debate. They love a good argument. And so I had never been to Oslo, and so it immediately said yes, and I went on my way. And I was in a debate, public forum, with the minister, and surprisingly, Minister Sondheim, Minister of Development, said, "We all have to accept that aid has contributed to the dysfunctionality of African governments." And I looked at him stunned, because I was like, hang on, he's making my points for me. But I was very happy to hear that. And I think that is really, really important. Here is a government minister who supports the aid regime, but he at the same time is critical enough to say, let's accept where it is lacking. I will come back to this point a little bit later, but suffice it to say the manner in which aid is causing a dysfunctionality of African governments does vary. On the one hand, we know, if you went outside now and polled 100 people and asked them what they think the problem with aid is to Africa, most people would say corruption. So that's a big story. It's always in the news. But even in the best case scenarios, one of the problems with the aid system is that it allows African governments to abdicate their responsibilities of providing public goods to people like me. So I will come back to this point because it's very, very important. It's actually at the crux of the problem that we're facing in Africa today. So those are the 3 points, and I hope that you bear them in mind. As I said, number one, we want to see Africa develop. Number two, we want to get African governments engaged. And number three, we have to accept that aid has certainly contributed to the dysfunctionality of African governments. I did jump ahead a little bit because I haven't really explained what I mean by aid. On page 7 of my book, I believe, I do explain that there are different types of aid, and very quickly I delineate them into 3 categories. The first type of aid is what we would call humanitarian or emergency aid. So think about Katrina or an earthquake in Iran or the tsunami or floods in Mozambique. And I think we as a global society have a moral imperative to act when that kind of thing happens. And so I am not criticizing emergency aid. The second type of aid is what I'd call NGO and charitable aid. So this is sort of send $3 a month to build a well in Zambia, which is where I'm from, or send $10 a month to help a girl go to school. I myself am involved in charities, quite a number of fantastic charities. One of them had a gala, which is why I was a bit late coming to North Carolina. called Room to Read, which is an education charity. And I think it's very important that we understand the limitations of that type of aid. Yes, a girl can go to school, but we should not delude ourselves into thinking that somehow the African continent is going to grow at 10% a year simply because we're sending $10 towards a charitable initiative. And I stress this because I'm not saying don't send money towards building a well, but understand that it's not fundamentally going to overhaul the African condition so that Africa can be an equal partner on the global stage. Just as a metric worth watching, the UN believes or argues that African countries need to grow at around 7% a year in order to meaningfully put a dent in poverty. Does anybody know what the average rate of growth in Africa is for this year forecasted? Any guesses? Say again? Yeah, that's right. It's about 2%. In fact, the IMF until April was forecasting it to be around 3%. And I went to see the head of the IMF. He'd asked me to visit with him about the book, and that was a pretty good growth rate. I mean, it was, given what's happened in the past 18 months, it's quite a good growth rate compared to where the global growth was projected at 0.5 and a number of regions growing negatively. But the point there is that 3% growth is nowhere near the 7% that we need, minimum that we need to actually meaningfully put a dent in poverty. So anyway, I digress. The point is that that's the second type of aid, is NGO, charitable aid. Go ahead and do it, but understand it's not going to transform the continent. The third type of aid is the aid that I'm criticizing, which is the $1 billion, just so you know, it's $100 billion a year, over $100 billion a year that's going to Africa now. $100 billion a year of aid that goes from government to government every year. And as I said earlier in my opening remarks, this system has been in existence in some form or another since the 1950s. I want to just stop for a minute and take you back to the 1950s. This was a time post-World War II, and it was the time of the Marshall Plan. And I have to say that had I been a policymaker at that time, I probably would have been a big supporter of aid. It made sense. And the link was very simple, and I'm sure there are economists in the room. The idea was that savings leads to investment, and investment leads to growth. And from growth, you could get a reduction in poverty. And remember, this was coming out of the Marshall Plan, which had been incredibly successful, which is about $100 billion in today's terms, that was sent from the United States to Europe. And I'll come back to this point because there have been some successful stories of aid, but the difference between those type of interventions and the type of intervention of aid that we have in Africa today is that programs like the Marshall Plan were short, sharp, and finite. So the Marshall Plan, $100 billion over 5 years, they went in and they left. That is not the system that we're grappling with today in Africa. And I'll come back to this point as well because basically it's, again, at the core of the issue. Many African governments view aid money as permanent income. They do not see a time when aid is ever going to end, and that is a big problem. But suffice it to say that at that time, it would have made sense to make the case for aid replacing savings, because many African countries were coming out of colonialism and didn't have this domestic savings that would lead to investment, that would lead to growth and reduce poverty. So we put in the aid money, and the aid was supposed to lead to investment, and that investment was supposed to lead to growth and reduce poverty. It made sense. But here we are now, 50, 60 years later. On those two metrics, increase in growth and reduction of poverty, aid has absolutely failed. Paul Collier, who many of you may be familiar with, his work, he's written a book called The Bottom Billion, was actually my PhD supervisor. And he has a fantastic phrase where he talks about Africa shearing off from the rest of the world. So the world is going in one direction and Africa is going in a completely different direction. Per capita income, so the amount of income that Africans earn today is lower than it was 40 years ago. I've already told you the poverty statistics. And this is layered on with the fact that over 60% of Africans are under the age of 24. So we've got a very, very young population, and this is basically a time bomb. We're not creating jobs fast enough. We've created a Band-Aid solution, and ultimately we have a situation where over the long term, those young people will not have opportunities, they will not have jobs, And we've created a system where we as Africans are addicted to donor money when the donor countries themselves have a financial crisis. Again, something I'll come back to.